Yesterday was municipal election day in Connecticut. One race that we covered on this channel was the mayoral race in New Haven, between incumbent Toni Harp and her opponent Justin Elicker. If you recall, Harp lost the Democratic primary to Elicker, but because she had been cross-endorsed by the Working Families Party, she was still on yesterday's ballot. Elicker was considered the likely winner, and yesterday, this was shown to be true. In that video, I explained that electoral fusion voting enables different political parties to run the same candidate for the same office on the same ballot. Back then, I wanted to briefly explain what electoral fusion voting was in order to better tell the story of what happened in New Haven. After publication, however, I realized that there are a lot of people who really aren't that aware of what electoral fusion voting is or why it exists. So in light of yesterday's election, and because next year is a huge election year, I thought it would be a great opportunity to discuss electoral fusion voting. Let's start by taking a look at the 2018 general election ballot to check out fusion voting in practice. As you can see, Bob Stefanowski was on both the Republican Party's and the Independent Party's lines, whereas Ned Lamont was featured on both the Democratic Party's and the Working Families Party's lines. When ballots were collected in November 2018, the votes for each candidate were calculated irrespective of party. In other words, the Republican Party's Bob Stefanowski votes and the Independent Party's Bob Stefanowski votes were added together to create a vote total for Bob Stefanowski. The same was true for Ned Lamont on the Democratic Party and Working Families Party's lines. To be clear, you can only vote for one candidate in one position on one party line. For example, voters were unable to vote for Bob Stefanowski on both the Republican Party's and also the Independent Party's lines. They had to choose one. That may be well and good, but why is this even a thing? According to MSNBC, electoral fusion voting allows smaller parties to have an impact on the election and forces lawmakers to pay attention to the platforms of these parties. It also allows voters to support the platform of a party without feeling that their vote will go to waste if they don't cast it for a Democrat or Republican. Let's break this down. Many people think that the candidate who wins a majority of votes wins, but that's not entirely true. For example, if you look at Connecticut's 2018 gubernatorial election, Bob Stefanowski won 46% of the vote, whereas Ned Lamont won 49% of the vote, with the rest of the votes going to third-party candidates. No candidate won with a majority of the votes, but because Ned Lamont received the highest number, a plurality, of votes, he won the election. As it stands now, the current system is vulnerable to what's known as the spoiler effect. We talked about this voting dynamic back in February, when a group of activists were attempting to change how Connecticut votes. Let me demonstrate the spoiler effect. Let's say there are two mainstream candidates, a liberal and a conservative. But let's say there's a group of conservative voters who do not think the conservative candidate is conservative enough. If they vote for a more conservative third-party candidate, they risk splitting the votes and enabling the liberal candidate to win. That's the spoiler effect. Electoral fusion voting does not mean that this spoiler effect cannot occur, but it does allow for voters to send a message to candidates without voting for a third-party candidate. For example, in November 2016, Donald Trump appeared on the ballot in California on both the Republican Party and the American Independent Party lines. Conservative voters who were concerned that Trump would deviate from traditional conservative orthodoxy were able to send a message by voting on the American Independent Party line, while still supporting the mainstream Republican candidate. In Connecticut, the Working Families Party and the Independent Party frequently cross-endorse candidates in this way. The Independent Party typically cross-endorses with Republicans, whereas the Working Families Party generally cross-endorses with Democrats. Electoral fusion voting does have its critics. They argue that electoral fusion voting is needlessly complicated and that its successes are hard to quantify or measure. Some members of both the Democratic and Republican parties worry that voting for mainstream candidates on third-party ballot lines puts their party at a disadvantage in terms of ballot placement. You see, statewide ballot lines are organized by the previous election's vote total. The party with the most votes gets the first line on the ballot next time. The party with the second most votes gets the second line, and so on and so forth. But if the vote is split between major and minor parties, it makes it more difficult for a party to have a better position on the ballot. Today, Connecticut is one of only 8 states that still use electoral fusion voting, but it wasn't always this way. In the late 1800s, fusion voting was widespread, but after minor parties started gaining momentum, state legislatures controlled by mainstream political parties started banning electoral fusion voting. But given the displeasure today that many people across the United States have with the two-party system, I wouldn't be surprised if more states start to consider similar alternatives.